Good morning. You join me on a very bright and chilly start on this January morning for a church crawl in North Yorkshire. Today we're going to be visiting the sites of 3 medieval parish churches and 2 former monastic houses in villages surrounding Easingwold, just near the A19. So where we're walking now is by a stream. Back there was, marked on the OS map, an old well, or a holy well, called St John's Well, a chalybeate spring, meaning that there was a particular source of iron in that water that was emerging from the ground there. So we've walked past that, not much to see from this side of the bank, but we're heading towards the site of Monasteries Priory, an old Augustinian nunnery, and when we get there we'll talk a little bit more about its history.
First we come to the site of Monasteries Priory around Moxby Hall Farm. Moxby Priory formed part of a rare double monastery of Augustinian canons and nuns founded in the 12th century at Marton Abbey just to the north. The nuns moved to a new nunnery dedicated to St John the Evangelist here at Moxby in 1167, having left the company of the monks at Marton where a priory had been founded 13 years earlier or so. Interestingly, the nuns were recorded in 1310 as belonging to the order of St Benedict, but had become Augustinian by 1326. The Augustinians were not monks in the strict sense, but rather communities of canons or priests living under the rule of St Augustine. From the 12th century onwards, they undertook much valuable work in the parishes, running almshouses and hospitals, as well as preaching in parish churches. The site of Moxby Priory today is a protected scheduled monument, although anything visible of the Augustinian nunnery itself doesn't survive. The listing description tells us the known remains at Moxby include the earthwork remains of ancillary buildings of the nunnery, including a series of irregular compounds, a moated enclosure, one side of an elongated mill dam, and the site of the monastic mill. The mill, which continued in use after the dissolution of the nunnery, was powered by the River Foss, which lies directly to the east.
That was a little bit of a shame not to be able to get too close to any of the earthworks of Moxby Priory, but having looked it up online last night, I expected access and visibility to be very limited. So anyway, now we're heading onwards to the villages of Stillington, where there's a good church, and also the churches at the villages further afield of Marton in the Forest and Crake. So let's crack on and head towards those places.
The Church of St Nicholas in Stillington was originally medieval, but substantially rebuilt in 1840 by architects J.B. and W. Atkinson, who replaced the west tower and nave entirely. Inside there is a fine collection of 19th century box pews, not rare but quite pleasant in their simplicity, and they contribute to the rural character of this lovely church. Towards the east end of the building there is a fine and substantial ensemble of various arts and crafts fittings by the workshop of Robert Mouseman Thompson of Kilburn. Whilst this church isn't full of historical treasures, its windows contain late medieval and modern glass. There are some interesting benefaction boards, and generally it's worth having an explore. When the sunlight pours in through the tall Gothic windows hitting these whitewashed walls, there is something quite satisfying about the effect this building has on you. There is nothing harsh about this space, and it's very inviting. Everything appears orderly and presentable.
Having crossed the River Foss at Stillington on the way to Marton in the Forest, you get a really good view of Crake up on the hill from here. So where we're heading now is the village of Marton in the Forest. So called because once upon a time this whole area was covered by a huge forest called the Forest of Galtres, although that doesn't really exist anymore. And a lot of the village is actually a scheduled monument. It's a deserted medieval village. All that remains now is the predominantly 16th century parish church. Marton Priory, which we're going to visit, is not in the village, and it doesn't form part of that scheduled monument where the site of the old village was. It's actually further towards Craik in the other direction. So we're going to head there afterwards and then on to Craik.
Nicholas Pevsner describes St Mary's as an atmospheric, isolated church. The astonishing exterior, with its crow-stepped gables and unusual two-storey south porch, is due to a rebuilding probably in or around the year 1540, using stone sculpture removed from the remains of Marton Priory immediately after the dissolution of the monasteries. This includes a carved angel and a tracery head from a perpendicular window, now forming the outer porch doorway. As you step inside, be sure to take a look at the late medieval south door with carved tracery, perhaps also removed from Marton Priory. The north wall, built of undressed stone, possibly or possibly not from the River Foss, along with the depressed chancel arch and lower parts of the south and east walls, tell us that the church probably clings to its 12th century footprint. Pevsner also states the church was over-enthusiastically restored in 1886, and the building does lose some charm when you step inside. Although clearly cherished by its congregation today, there are few features of historical interest, aside from a set of 17th century bench ends, with stunted trefoil terminals now affixed to more modern plain seats and backs. Some of the interior walls show signs of modern strap pointing between the exposed brickwork, which I find unsightly. But all in all, a very pleasant rural church with a fascinating built history related to the nearby priory and located in a beautiful setting on the edge of the Howardian Hills.
So having left Marton in the forest, you can see that I'm starting to make my way up Harryfield Lane to the site of Marton Priory with extensive earthworks. A much larger site than what survives of Moxby Priory, where we were earlier on this morning. And then we're going to continue up the Foss Walk, getting quite hilly there, to Craik. And you can see how hilly it gets because that's Craik right there. It's actually quite spectacular, the view today. It gives you a real sense of what this area would have looked like even hundreds of years ago. And you can see there, that is presumably Marton Abbey, what it's called today, the site of the Augustinian Priory. And there's Craik up on the hill to the left. But you'd be able to imagine, couldn't you, the site of a priory there being quite obvious. I suppose there would have been a big forest around here, so maybe it would have been hidden. But it's a great sort of topography to take in today, because you can actually see, perhaps clearer than in the past, the proximity of these villages and the priories, well, in particular Marton and Craik. I just thought this was a great opportunity to give a top-down perspective looking down on the landscape and the settlements.
The priory at Marton, dedicated to St Mary, preceding that of its partner, Moxby Priory, was founded by Bertram de Bulmer, High Sheriff of Yorkshire, in 1154. Here we can see extensive earthworks which mark the site of the priory and relate to aspects of water management connected to fish farming, including ponds, a reservoir and a water mill. The site has been noted specifically for its water engineering, which was on a heroic scale like that at Rievaulx Abbey. The River Foss still runs in a diversion channel excavated to the west above the valley floor, so that the fish ponds whose earthworks remain prominent could be constructed in the lower parts. Whilst the remains are located on a working farm, and I didn't want to loiter for too long today, I did spot on the front of the farmhouse 2 label stop heads, a shield and a crown, and an angel with a scroll over a lion's head, all undoubtedly recycled sculptural stone from the priory ruins. Now we come to the village of Craik. From this isolated hillside stranding the northerly edge of the Vale of York, it's said that from a clear day in St Cuthbert's churchyard, you can see the towers of York Minster some 30 miles away to the south. Through the village, the houses cling to the steep hill slope with dignity, as writer Ella Pontefract noted many years ago. Craig is recorded as having been granted to St Cuthbert and his successors, the bishops of Lindisfarne, in 685, together with the land around it within 3 miles, by Ecgfrith of Northumberland, as the site of a house in which to rest on journeys to and from York. This led to a belief that a monastery was established here, perhaps known as St Mary de Pratis or St Mary of the Plain, along with a hospitium beneath the hill. You can pause the video here for more information on the history of the purported monastery. Craik was certainly regarded as a holy place, and its prominent hill a significant landmark, for it was the place of settlement of an anchorite or hermit called Etta or Ecca, Craik's second saint after St Cuthbert, whose feast day is on May the 5th and is still venerated on the nearest Sunday to this date in the calendar. Again, you can pause the video here to read more about Ecca. Evidently, the local area I've walked today is spotted with various monastic histories spanning from the early medieval period to the later Middle Ages, and Ecca forms one part of the local folklore of this rich spiritual landscape. But now we move inside to have a look in this ancient parish church on the hill. Until 1844, the village was a part of the county of Durham, and in 1837 the ecclesiastical parish was transferred by order in council from the diocese of Durham to that of York. St Cuthbert's church was substantially rebuilt in the 15th century. As such, the church is almost immediately recognisable as a classic example of North Yorkshire Gothic perpendicular architecture, standing proud with some of the more stately rural churches rebuilt in that century, in this period and in this county. The central worship spaces are filled with the most attractive dark wood furnishings dating from the 17th century, and the best way to appreciate this ensemble arrangement is to stand in the pulpit and look west across the sea of nave pews towards those which are raised behind the font. E.G. Paley, architect of Lancashire, cut down and reassembled the pews during his restoration in the 1860s, but the impact is largely not noticeable today. The pulpit itself is an excellent object dated 1637 on the perimeter of the antique soundboard above, with an inscription reading, "Show me the ways, O Lord, and teach me thy paths." One of the more modern additions is that of the chancel screen, now a wall memorial with modern names carved in, although it is a reconstruction of the late medieval screen which stood for centuries here previously. The surviving Gothic woodwork becomes apparent on closer inspection of the detailed tracery carvings. In the southeast corner of the nave are 2 effigies depicting Sir John Gibson and his wife Margaret, who died in the late 15th century. They are in contemporary costume, but are partially obscured by an ugly corner shelf which clearly served an obscure purpose at some point, but now apparently exists simply to annoy anybody who might wish to appreciate this fine historic tomb. The north aisle is a restoration, also by E.G. Paley of Lancashire. The north aisle interior feels like it belongs to an entirely different church, having been reordered and fitted with up-to-date facilities and amenities to meet the basic needs of a modern congregation. The altar is partially medieval, with an old mensa top put back into use. There is also a new stained glass window installed in 2020, the work of renowned glazier Helen Whittaker, working with Barley Studios based in Dunnington near York. The theme is that of St Cuthbert, who we have heard has such strong ties to the early history of this village and church.
Well, I'm now walking into the sun with Craik Castle behind me, on the way to Easingwold to head home to York. Thank you for joining me on another Yorkshire church crawl, and I hope to see you again soon.